So I would like to welcome our three panelists joining us this evening: Professor Wanning Sun from UTS, Dr. David Brophy from the University of Sydney, and Green Senator David Shoebridge. Welcome all to Chatswood. So our first speaker tonight is Dr. Brophy, who will address the geopolitical and party political dimensions of AUKUS. Dr. Brophy is an Australian historian of modern Chinese history at the University of Sydney, where he is a senior lecturer. He is noted for his contribution to the debate in Australia on Sino-Australian relationship, and is the author of Uyghur Nation and the China Panic. Dr. Brophy.
Thanks very much, Nick and Julia, and thank you all for being here tonight. It's wonderful to see such a full room. I know there are a lot of distractions in Chatswood on a Saturday evening, so thank you very much for giving this issue your attention. I'm going to just set out some basic points, hopefully not too basic, and then we'll be able to dig into the details, I'm sure, with David Wanning and the discussion. Look, I oppose AUKUS. And I think you should too. But I want to say tonight that AUKUS is a symptom of a deeper issue. What exactly is that issue? I want to argue that the issue is not simply subservience to the US, but an Australian militarism that exhibits a will to dominate the wider region that currently manifests through subservience to the US, but need not. Australia, if you look at its history, is a creature of empire. It has its own imperial ambitions embedded in its founding. And today you only have to look at the frenetic activity that goes into preserving Australia's hegemony in the Pacific, seeking to lock in exclusive partnerships with a widening range of countries, integrating the Australian and Pacific militaries, offering things like service for citizenship swaps. There's a thought bubble that floats up in Canberra from time to time that some of these countries might be given migration pathways in case of climate disaster in exchange for ceding some of their sovereignty to Australia. These sorts of ambitions for a mini empire have, however, historically been thought to be too big for Australia's own strength and resources. So Australian foreign policy has always centred on recruiting an outside force to boost its capacity. Now this generates a constant anxiety that this outside patron may not be sufficiently committed to these objectives. And if you listen to Australian politicians, they're very frank about this. I can just quote most recently Andrew Hastie's Anzac Day oration, in which he referred to, quote, the uncertainty at the heart of the ANZUS alliance that has led Australian governments to deepen our military relationship with the United States to ensure their support in our time of trial. So there's uncertainty on all sides. I think we're quite familiar with the current American skepticism towards the willingness of allies like Australia to stand up to China, but that uncertainty applies equally to Australia's view of the US. So what I'm getting at here is that in something like AUKUS, it's not that Australian interests are being set aside to advance American interests. There's a consensus in Canberra that Australian interests entail increasing commitments to keep America engaged in Asia. So AUKUS needs to be seen not as blindly following the US, but more as a kind of lobbying strategy towards the US, designed to demonstrate Australia's relevance to American interests, and therefore anchor America in Australia's wider region. Now that of course does raise questions as to Australian sovereignty. It is the case as a result of AUKUS that we've locked ourselves into a situation where things that we ordinarily associate with sovereignty, things like the choice of whether to go to war or not, do feel compromised, if not entirely lost. But that's been compromised as a result of decisions made by Australians and decisions that could be unmade by Australians. So if you buy what I'm saying, then An important determinant of the fluctuations in Australia's foreign policy stance is the question of what is Canberra's view of America's willingness and capacity to contain China. And there have been points in recent history where a view developed in Canberra that American will in that direction was flagging, and that therefore Australia had to do more to impress on Washington the risk of China's rise, and to show Australia's willingness to play a role in coordinating a containment campaign. I think that summary essentially describes Australia's response to the first Trump election. And if you remember the hawkish turn that Malcolm Turnbull took us on in 2017, you might think back to him whipping up a foreign interference scare, the speech that he gave in Chinese, that the Australian people had stood up. It produced a lot of domestic ramifications that I think Wanning is going to delve into. Of course, it is interesting to note that Malcolm Turnbull is now striking quite a different tone on this question, that the path from China hawk to China dove for retired politicians is a very well-worn one. Malcolm Fraser became a notable America skeptic late in life. This is quite common. My reading of the situation then is that by the end of Trump 1, Australia had renewed confidence that Trump was not quite the isolationist that he had sometimes pretended to be in his run for election. That confidence in America's determination was then increased, I think, with Biden and the signing of AUKUS. It provided enough confidence, in any case, that the ALP could tone down the rhetoric slightly and try to claw back some of the trade relationship with China in the name of stabilization. Because after all, no one in their right mind actually wants to be on the front lines of a war with China. If America looks to be playing its imperial role, then Australia is happy to step back and let the US do the heavy lifting. Now, I would go so far actually to argue that given this, all the talk around AUKUS that Australia might not actually ever get the AUKUS submarines is a little bit misguided. Because I think the objective here is served well enough if all the other elements of this eventuate. If America has more troops of its own in the Northern Territory, if it has more ships docked in Western Australia, well, if Australia ultimately ends up not being able to commit its own submariners to a war with China, that's not the end of the world. The key, though, is despite this new language of stabilization and stability in this period of Labor government, all of those basic policy settings that led to the signing of AUKUS remain in place. Those policy settings are directed towards preparing Australia for war with China. That remains the guiding principle of Australian foreign and defence policy. And I think we have to be very frank on this point. This is a policy of aggression towards China. People often talk about deterrence, but it's not deterrence in the standard sense of deterring an attack on Australia. It's deterring any move by China in China's neighbourhood. Now, you might well feel that a military move by China towards its neighbours would be a bad thing, and I feel that way myself. But you just have to imagine how we might feel if China said that it was its principle of its strategic planning to be able to win a military conflict in the Bass Strait or in the Arafura Sea. If China announced that it was focusing its military planning on that objective, clearly here in Australia that would be seen as an aggressive move on China's part. I don't think there's any doubt about that. That is Australia's current stance towards China. And that sort of stance just cannot help but stir up xenophobia, create fertile conditions for those who want to advance a more explicit Cold War politics, like the Liberals, like One Nation. It's true that there has been more of a rhetorical emphasis recently on self-reliance, but I don't want you to be misled by that. self-reliance in the hands of Australian politicians. This is not self-sufficiency or independence. Self-reliance is a term that refers to an increased capacity for Australia to defend itself and American installations in the event of a US-led war with China. This talk of self-reliance, of course, does resonate with a wider right-wing mood that embraces the turn away from liberal internationalism towards a more hard-edged discourse of Australian interests, Australia First nationalism, if you like. But there are limits to that. And it's interesting to note the way those on the right who dabble with more Trumpian rhetoric find themselves in an awkward position. Well, we saw that fairly clearly, I think, with Andrew Hastie's recent line on Iran, where there was quite forthright criticism of Trump's decision to go to war. But then if we go back to his oration that I mentioned earlier, it's very explicit there. The talk of building Australia's sovereign defence capacity remains entirely wedded to the traditional policy of recruiting American support. Apologies for the slightly cringy language in this quote, but he said, "We need to strengthen our dingo so that we can be a better partner to the eagle." So obviously Trump is highly unpredictable. There are optimists among the China hawks who see that unpredictability as a positive. He's keeping America's adversaries guessing, but there are pessimists too, of course. And I'll draw to a close in a second, but a question that a lot of people ask when they look at this situation is, might there come a time when Australia reevaluates this positioning? Could there be a point at which the evidence just becomes so persuasive, China's military advantage vis-a-vis the US just so obvious, that Australia might, of its own accord, decide that this traditional strategy of cultivating an American presence in Asia is past its use-by date? Now, opinions might differ on that. I have to say personally, I'm not particularly optimistic. Even airing the possibility, if you look at the reception that Hugh White's publications receive in the foreign policy establishment, even airing this possibility is seen as damaging the relationship, quote unquote. Hardly conducive conditions for the emergence of a new consensus. So in the absence of that reevaluation, we do remain on a collision course. The rethink that is needed will come not from calm evaluation in Canberra, but potentially through military crisis or war, by which time it may be too late to avoid catastrophe. So at this point, it seems to me that the only thing really able to divert us from this path is popular opposition to this strategy, which is why your presence here tonight is so important. But just one final point, as I opened by suggesting, if we really do want peace in our time, that will require not just a rethinking of the relationship with the US, but a rethinking of Australia's own imperial attitude towards the region, and a thorough opposition to Australian militarism in all its forms. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Brophy. One thing you might have noticed on the screen is throughout this evening we'll be taking questions from the audience through Slido. So the process for submitting questions is that just scan the QR code and submit your questions. So please direct your question to a specific panelist where possible. We now move on to our second speaker this evening. Professor Wanning Sun is a professor of Media and Cultural Studies at the University of Technology, Sydney. She also serves as Deputy Director of the UTS Australia-China Relations Institute, a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities since 2016. She is best known in her field of China Studies for her ethnography of internal and transnational Chinese migration. She was a member of the ARC College of Experts from 2020 to 2023. These days, Wanning writes about Chinese-Australian communities, Australia-China relations, and Australian media discourses of China. She is a columnist for Crikey. So this evening, Professor Sun will examine the relationship between media constructions of a China threat, public opinion those narratives produce, and how they provide political conditions for bipartisan support for AUKUS. She will also address the impact of those narratives on Chinese-Australian communities and how they are responding. Professor Sun.
This one works?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me and to share my thoughts and research with so many people from the public. And as an academic, I don't get to that opportunity very often. So I really appreciate that. As Julia said, tonight I mainly want to focus on two things. First of all, I want to talk about the impact of China threat narrative on the Chinese Australian communities. And the second point I want to make is how Chinese Australians communities respond and react to AUKUS. I think David Brophy has just provided a very nice, useful general context and background in which this point will be made. And David mentioned in 2018, Australia passed this foreign interference legislation. And since then, ASIO, and you know all what ASIO is, let me spell it out. ASIO has really pivoted to countering foreign interference and kind of downgraded anti-terrorism. And in fact, ASIO is now under the spotlight for what happened during the Bondi attack and the subsequent inquiry. And according to ASIO, in the last 2 years, the reality of foreign interferences in Australia is certain, whereas the threat of terrorism is possible. So ASIO's pivot actually went hand in hand with media, right? So starting from around then, you probably remember, starting 2017 and 2018, we started to see the return of what I call the Cold War style journalism in Australia, and particularly in its reporting about China. That is increasingly dominated, narrative is the overriding China threat discourse, and the original idea of China threat discourse is that because of China's rise, as David alluded to, and then it becomes a source of anxiety for America and its allies, for the entire global West, because of its economic might, its political influence, and its strategic sort of growth, as well as its possibility of China's military threat. And technological, of course. And some scholars argue that, including David himself in his book China Panic, which I recommend highly to those who want to know more about it, and then scholars like Andrew Chubb, who have followed the development of the China threat discourses since 2017 and the role of the media in the formation of this China threat discourse. And they argue that it is due to the formation and the growing and dominance of what Andrew Chubb calls the coalition of securitizers that led to this kind of prevalence of the China threat discourse. This is security of securitizers consists of three parties mainly. One is the political elites, people like Malcolm Turnbull and the party. And second one is the security intelligence agency. And the third one is the media, right? So they work together to promote a sense of China as a threat. Now, a key aspect of the China threat narrative is the questioning of the role of the Chinese Australians, especially the first generation migrants from the PRC, who now have come to be, in demographic terms, more than half of the 1.4 million Chinese people with Chinese heritage in Australia. Now, of course, a lot of what Beijing has done is a source of concern, and the Australian government and ASIO has its right to be concerned about that and want to do something about it. For instance, China remains, a source of transnational repression of some of its dissidents, and is known to adopt coercive, political and trade practices overseas. So these concerns are indeed warranted. But the purpose of the anti-China and China narrative agenda is to purportedly protect the Chinese diaspora from the Chinese government's surveillance, and especially protecting those who fear Chinese government's persecution. That was the kind of main reason that's the raison d'etre for their operation. But in reality, the security agencies practically turned the whole Chinese community into possible suspects and the potential agents who could be helping the Chinese government to peddle Chinese influences and securitize and scrutinizes their fellow Chinese Australian compatriots. So in other words, ASIO has effectively started to treat the entire community into what Andrew Charles called the vectors of threat. Now, the vectors of threat in a language of security and intelligence circle means the people as the actors, active actors who help the Chinese state to push the Chinese political agenda. And so this has made the public, you probably have, have familiar tropes of Chinese espionage, Chinese organizations involved with the United Front, so on and so forth. Quite familiar narratives. If you read the mainstream media, you probably can't avoid these kind of stories, the kind of perennial stories. What happened, the result of this is made the Australian public more distrustful of the Chinese communities as a whole. I'll just give you some data points here to prove my point. My institute, Australian China Research Relations Institute, publishes an annual poll, and for 3 years in a row, 2023, 2024, 2025, for 3 years in the poll, and the poll finds that every 4 in 10 Australians believe that Chinese Australians could be mobilized by Beijing to undermine Australia's interest and social cohesion. That's 4 in 10, just think of the number. And it's 3 years in a row, and that hasn't really changed, regardless of the changes with this coalition or Labour in power. Now, this distrust has been felt by many of the sections of Chinese Australian communities. Because I'm a media studies scholar, so I'm interested in the consumption of news by ethnic communities. So I conducted a survey of 700 Chinese Australians and asking them how they related to Australia's mainstream coverage of China. And my survey show that 7 in 10, that's 70% of my survey respondents believe that Australia's English language media tended to portray them as objects of suspicion and risk to national security. There's also a wide perception among my survey respondents that the Australia's English language media reporting on PRC-related issues has led to a low level of acceptance of their community by the Australian public. About 6 in 10 respondents self-reported feelings of emotional and mental anguish and helplessness in response to the media's perceived othering rhetoric in the reporting of matters that relate to China and the Chinese Australian communities. But when it comes to the government's rhetoric on social cohesion, you hear a lot about social cohesion these days, don't you? This community is a silent cohort because they don't go out and make noises. So in my survey, an overwhelming majority, that is 91% of the respondents said they were extremely concerned or quite concerned about what might happen to them in the event of a war with the PRC. Because they have knowledge of the internment of migrants from hostile countries during the war, migrants from Germany, from Italy, and from Japan. And it makes them wonder if they will be interned as well, if somehow China goes to war with the US, and Australia is US's ally, and therefore China is considered to be a hostile nation. So Australia's general public has maintained, on the whole, things have improved a little bit, but generally Australia's general public has maintained a high level of support for AUKUS. For instance, if you look at Lowy's poll, 2/3 of Australians still remain somewhat or strongly in favour of acquiring nuclear-powered submarines under AUKUS. And even though the percentages kind of slightly dropped over the last couple of years, but on the whole, the support is still high. And I would submit that this has a lot to do with the public opinion that is whipped up by the media. So it's a kind of a vicious circle, if you like. Public opinion, media, public opinion, foreign policy, and back to the public opinion. So among the people in various Chinese communities who do know about AUKUS, of course a lot of people, if you ask them about AUKUS, they will say, what is AUKUS? So it's not very surprising, because if you ask a lot of people in the general public, they will say, yeah, I heard vaguely about the AUKUS, but I don't know exactly what it is. Is this something to do with submarines? Or so they don't know the details. But I can tell you that the level of support for AUKUS among the Chinese Australian communities, regardless of the internal differences, whether they vote for Labour or vote for coalition, the support for AUKUS is lower than the general public. And I'll give you another data point. A Chinese Australian community forum held a kind of information session, if you like, inviting two people to debate on the pros and the cons for AUKUS. And that's the director of my center, James Lawrenson, versus director of our US Study Center in Sydney University. One is for, the other is against. And you can guess which is one which is against. After the talk, they conducted a poll among the people in this room, and there was more people in this room, in that room than in this room, and they found that 15% of the people in the room supported AUKUS, and 20% were undecided, with the rest, which is the majority, decidedly against AUKUS. Interestingly, after the debate, the number didn't change at all. So it did a poll before the debate, and it did a poll after so more than 2/3 of the Chinese communities were against AUKUS. But why is there not a public forum organized by or involve the Chinese communities, like this one here? Well, one of the key reasons I suggest is that the Chinese communities are worried of being suspected as peddling Chinese influence, and they do not dare to stand out. Because, as critics of AUKUS, including former Prime Minister Paul Keating, have argued that Australia's intelligence and security establishment have contributed to an atmosphere where any dissent on China policy or AUKUS becomes suspect. Right? And there's documented evidence of monitoring and investigation of Chinese communities, organizations, and individuals regularly. And Mike Burgess, who is the head of ASIO, has repeatedly said that the foreign interference threat linked to China are a major national security concern, and that AUKUS is one of their espionage targets. Now, I wouldn't mind telling you, to give you an example that I have experienced myself, just to show that this is true. some of the peace promoting organizations in Australia, some of them actually in this room, wanted to reach out to the Chinese communities, wanted to build sort of solidarities and the connections and engagement with the Chinese communities and get them to talk about AUKUS. And the discussion was going on very well, thinking about venue and topic, and towards the end, the Chinese community leaders just got cold feet, because they got together and they say, if we actually had a Chinese-focused event about AUKUS and made it clear that we're anti-AUKUS, that ASIO would be down on us in a flash, and this would be seen as masterminded by the CCP. And even though we as Chinese Australians, as citizens and residents in this country, have every right, as everybody here, to express their dissenting opinions. But nevertheless, if it is them, then they are much easier target. So as a result of that, that event didn't go ahead and still hasn't gone ahead. So I finished here with two messages. One is for the people in this room who are members of the public who are critical for AUKUS. That is by reminding you that of all the important reasons that why AUKUS is a bad idea, we should not forget that the rhetoric and the policies surrounding AUKUS has a real and harmful impact on the Chinese communities as well. So this is an important factor, and so far it's mostly missing, but it's important to bear in mind. The other message I want to give is to the Greens, to David. That is, I think the Greens will stand a good chance of winning some support from the Chinese communities if you have a three-pronged message, very clear three-pronged message. First, Green is against the AUKUS. Second, the Green is for independent foreign policy. And third, the Green is against the war. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sun. And on a personal note, as someone who grew up in Chatswood, I think it's very important that we show allyship with the Chinese Australian community. Thank you very much for your speech. And our final speaker is Senator Shoebridge, and he will address the sovereignty and security dimensions of AUKUS. Following his presentation, we will move to the question and answer session. So Senator Shoebridge is an Australian politician and former barrister. He's a member of the Australian Greens and was elected to the Senate as the party's lead candidate in New South Wales at the 2022 federal election to a term beginning on 1st of July 2022. He is the Green spokesperson for foreign affairs, peace and nuclear disarmament, and a passionate campaigner against nuclear warfare. Senator Shoebridge.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction. And I too want to start by acknowledging we're on First Nations land. And we all know this, I think, in this room. But we're talking about war. We're talking about one of the appalling impacts of AUKUS is bringing on nuclear waste into this country and being part of the nuclear waste cycle and the nuclear weapons cycle. And it's been First Nations communities across this country who have been on the front line protecting their land and their water against nuclear waste dumps and a nuclear industry for decades, if for no other reason. Let's tonight acknowledge this is First Nations land and commit to working with First Nations peoples to protect their land and water from the nuclear industry. Well, look, it's always a problem coming and speaking after a doctor and a professor on anything. You always think, well, what is there left to say? And I suppose maybe one thing is just to give you a sense of what the discussion is like down in Canberra, inside Parliament, on this issue. And sometimes I just think, am I losing touch with reality when I wander down in there? And I hear the three war parties, Labor, the Coalition and One Nation, all beating the drum and saying, oh, we need nuclear submarines to go to war with China. Oh, we need to bring in the US and we need to be nice to Donald Trump and we need to do all of this. And there are moments where I just wonder if I'm in some kind of alternate reality. Like, you know, do they not have a phone? You know, do they not have Google Maps? Like, what is wrong with these people? I'll give you an example. It was Senate estimates in February of this year, so not that long ago. And this woman called Michaela Cash, who's a senator for the coalition. I can tell some of you know her. She is a little to sort of the right of Genghis Khan. You know, that's her political point. And she's down there in the Defence Senate estimates. So there's me and a bunch of coalition and Labor senators. And then there's a room about as many people as in this room. And you imagine you all have gold braid on your shoulders and you're all part of the Defence Force or senior defence bureaucrats and you're all in there hating on me. That's kind of part of what happens in those Senate estimates things in defence. And then you've got the coalition and Labor peppering them with, asking them polite questions about why AUKUS is great. And there was this exchange between Michaela Cash and the senior defence bureaucrat for policy. Like the one who is directing the hive mind of defence about international relations and policy, Mr. Jeffries. And they're having this exchange and they're saying, well, look, you know, the world is clearly getting more dangerous, There are nation states who seem to have no regard for sovereignty, that seem to be willing to invade other countries, that are tearing down international law, that are tearing down the norms that have kept us safe, acting with aggression without having regard to their neighbours or the UN. And there is, you know, our region is feeling this particular, you know, these nation states that invade other countries within breach of international law are tearing down concepts of sovereignty and are ignoring the UN. And I'm sitting there and I can't help but butt in. I said, surely you're talking about the United States. And it was like I had done a fart in the elevator. Because they turned around and said, no, it's China. It's China that's been doing this. And this is how distorted the discussion point is there. And they were very serious. Like there's 100 people all nodding along. Senior Defence, the Chief of Defence, the Secretary of Department, all nodding along with this narrative. I say again, it's like they don't own a mobile phone, right? They're not seeing the world for what it is. And it's because to maintain the fiction of AUKUS and to maintain this unquestioning commitment to the United States alliance, to being a subservient player with the United States, you need to have a rhetoric about fear and war with China. And even if reality is wildly against you, they maintain the rhetoric in this extraordinary way. What is AUKUS? Maybe we should pull it apart a little bit. So there's two key points to AUKUS. The first one is called Pillar 1, and that's this plan to get nuclear submarines under Pillar 1 of AUKUS. The second is Pillar 2. And we don't often hear much discussion about Pillar 2, but Pillar 2 is in many ways more dangerous. Pillar 2 is a design to enmesh Australia's defence force and our industry and our research sector as just a single seamless part of the US military and the US defence industry. Remove all barriers for the exchange of information back and forth with the United States, remove all barriers for the exchange of weapons research and weapons parts, and just have this seamless integration of Australia with the United States. Now, if we were at all equal players in this, you might say, well, you could retain sovereignty of some sort. But we're like a pimple on a pumpkin when it comes to this. And that Pillar 2 part of it is in many ways the most dangerous. Because when we remove all barriers and invite US weapons companies here, when we just send all of our research there and we can't see a distinction between Australia's research and industry and the US, we get completely subsumed. We become the 51st state, only without a vote. Like, it is an extraordinary proposition, Pillar 2. But maybe I'll just go back to Pillar 1. So Pillar 1 was the sort of key point of AUKUS. That is where we're meant to get this optimal pathway under which we get, maybe, if all goes well, about 8 nuclear-powered submarines. And the last one is meant to come online in about 2060. And I find extraordinary about AUKUS is, it was announced in 2021, and agreed to by Labor and the Coalition in 2021, there was never a formal cabinet brief. There was never a business case. There was never a critical analysis from Defence or Foreign Affairs. It was literally signed on to as a vibe kind of thing. And they'd sort it all out later. And in 2021, when Labor were in opposition, the three senior players who are now in Labor government, Prime Minister Albanese, Richard Marles as Defence Minister and Penny Wong as Foreign Minister, all in their opposition phase. Do you know they got a 2-hour no docs briefing from Scott Morrison? Do you remember Scott Morrison? Could you imagine going into a room with Scott Morrison, with no documents, no briefing? I think there might have been PowerPoint. And at the end of 2 hours of talking with Scott Morrison, say, yep, that's great, we're going to sign on to AUKUS, commit to $375 billion and tie us to the United States for another five decades. Imagine doing that with no documents. Did I mention the sales guy was Scott Morrison? But we did. And I can tell you now, it's unraveling in real time. For us to have nuclear submarines from the United States, the plan is we get a couple of renovated second-hand Virginia-class submarines in the early 2030s from the United States. Now, the United States, in the treaty that we've signed and in their own domestic law, it clearly says the United States only has to give us nuclear submarines if they have any spare. And if there's a certification from the President and from the Secretary of the Navy that there are sufficient nuclear submarines in the United States to meet its own needs and provide additional for Australia. And in the early 2030s, because of historical production reasons, the United States is going to have an historic low number of nuclear submarines. And they have been desperately trying to increase the numbers for the last decade. And to get any spare submarines, even close to spare submarines for Australia, they've been having to produce about 2.2 nuclear submarines of these Virginia-class submarines a year for the last 5 years and going forward. They've been producing 1.1 or 1.2 in a good year. And in the last year, they produced just 1. And every year that gap grows, the likelihood of us ever getting a nuclear submarine gets further and further behind us. And that's one of the reasons why Australia keeps shoveling billions of dollars to the United States, and we've committed to $3 billion to the United States so that we can increase their submarine production capacity. We are sending Australian tax dollars for US welders and boilermakers to try and increase, and it hasn't moved the dial one bit. There is almost zero chance the United States will have spare nuclear submarines by the 2030s. The gap is getting bigger. They also want to produce another nuclear submarine at the same time, this huge thing called a Columbia-class submarine, which is a doomsday submarine full of intercontinental ballistic missiles, and the United States has said they're going to give priority to building those. So to put back Virginia-class submarines even further. We're highly unlikely, radically unlikely to get any spare nuclear submarines from the United States in the early 2030s. And guess how much money we get back if we don't get any? Not $1. There's no refund. The UK is the other partner in this. The UK is meant to be designing this new AUKUS SSN, which is just a fancy name for an attack class nuclear submarine. The UK is meant to be designing and building the reactor, and then we're doing a co-design for the hull and the other bits of it. Now, the UK's nuclear submarine industry is in freefall, complete freefall. There was all this celebration a few months ago because one UK nuclear submarine came and visited us in Perth. Does anyone remember that? Excitement, very exciting. Do you know why it was exciting? Because it was the only UK nuclear submarine that could actually go in the water at the time. All the others are in long-term refit because they don't work. They don't work. That's why it was exciting. It was their only one. And not only that, their nuclear reactor program, I said that they're going to make the nuclear reactor. It turns out, I think a nuclear reactor is critical for a nuclear submarine. That's my view. If you want a nuclear submarine, you've got to have a reactor. I think that's a key point. I've tested this with Defence, and they agree. But the UK Audit Office has been looking at the program to make the nuclear reactors. There's a struggling little company in the US called Rolls-Royce, which makes those nuclear reactors. And you'll be pleased to know we're giving $3 billion to Rolls-Royce to help them. You know, that's nice. You know, that's probably why there's a acute emergency here on the North Shore, because we've just given $3 billion to Rolls-Royce. The UK Audit Office has been looking at this reactor program for the last 5 years. And it's been red, 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 red. And when they put them in red in the UK Audit Office, it means the project is not on track, it will not work, and it cannot achieve its outcomes. There will be no reactors from the UK nuclear reactor program, and we keep funneling money in. And so when I see Richard Marles come up, Richard Marles, the Defence Minister, come up and say he's absolutely, the UK is committed to AUKUS and they're committed and we're on track, and the US is committed, and I went over and I met Pete Hegseth and he said he was committed. Like, it's just words. It is just this bizarre word salad. Because the reality in both of those countries, they can say whatever they like. They are not in a position to produce these nuclear submarines for us or nuclear boats. It's not going to happen. So what is going to happen? Well, right now, Australia is in the middle of spending $8 billion of Australian taxpayers' money to build the US a nuclear attack submarine base just off Perth at a place called Garden Island, HMAS Sterling. $8 billion, and it's going to be up and running by 2027. When on no pathway are we meant to have nuclear submarines by 2027, and the US is perfectly happy with this. They don't really need us to have nuclear submarines, but they bloody well want a nuclear submarine base built by Australian taxpayers just off Perth, and it's going to open in 2027. The purpose of having that is it's a shorter route to get up to the Malacca Straits and to get up and to make war on China. It's shorter to go from Perth than it is from San Diego. It's like getting a bonus, 1 or 2 bonus submarines, because it reduces the pathway. They also want to have an East Coast nuclear submarine base, most likely in Port Kembla. Again, it's to shorten the route to go and make war with China. Because let's remember this. Australia does not need nuclear submarines for our own defence. They make no sense at all for Australia's defence. All that nuclear submarines are good for is to be a part of a broader US deployment lurking off the coast of China, thousands and thousands of kilometres from our shores, to follow and shadow Chinese nuclear submarines in the event of a conflict between China and the United States. They are not about Australia's defence. You could have a cloud of conventional air-independent propulsion submarines if you chose to defend Australia. These are not about defending Australia. They're about inviting us into this war with China. And that is an incredibly dangerous and incredibly disastrous and a path we should not go. So, I'll finish with this. Why do we do that? And I think David and Wanning have touched upon this. We do this so that we are seen to be relevant to the United States, so that we keep them enmeshed here, because we're fearful of having our own defence force, our own defence and foreign affairs policy. We desperately want to enmesh the United States here. And that's why their bases are growing all over the country. And that's why we're building them for them. We have US nuclear capable B-52s in Tyndall. We have US Marines in Darwin. We have a US critical communications facility in Northwest Cape, in Western Australia. We have Pine Gap, and now we're building them 2 nuclear submarines because we want to enmesh them here. And do you know what that does? That puts us on the front line of any war between the United States and China. There is an existential threat here, right? It's a threat to our security. Our threat to our security doesn't come from China. Our threat to our security comes from our relationship with the United States, which invites and brings conflicts to this country and puts us on the front line of the next US war. And ask yourself this: if it got really hot, if it got really tough, a war between the United States and China, would Donald Trump, or son of Donald Trump, or whoever is the next US president, and they've got to make a task, would they trade Perth for Los Angeles? What do you think they'd do? I think they'd put America first, and I think it's time we put Australia first. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Senator Shoebridge. And so now we'll be moving on to the question and answer portion of this evening. And major financial commitment be made without any consultation with experts and the public. How can we change this possibility for the future?
Well, I mean, they just did. And this is the problem. There's this stultifying consensus, this completely unthinking consensus down in Canberra between the Labor Party, the coalition, and to the extent they think about a one nation, that they have no imagination to think of a different future apart from one where we just embed ourselves with the United States. And until we break their stranglehold on the Parliament and critical decision making, they're going to keep doing this to us. And so you ask, how could you possibly have a commitment for $375 billion without any core business case or documents? And the answer is because it's backing in the US alliance, and that's what they do, and they'll pay any price to do it. And they don't really care about the business model.
And our second question from Slido, again for Senator Shoebridge, is so China has not threatened Australian sovereignty, but China has threatened Taiwan. And isn't that why there is a heightened stance towards China?
Well, I'd be really interested in David and Wanning actually coming in on this. The idea that we would go to war with China because China seeks to invade Taiwan, I don't understand. The logic doesn't follow, right? The idea that we would invite ourselves to a conflict. I personally and strongly believe that the people of Taiwan should map their own future, and we should do whatever we can to allow the people of Taiwan to map their own future. But think about what a war with China over Taiwan would actually be for the people of Taiwan. Because the United States is committed to going to war with China if China invades Taiwan, not because Donald Trump or the United States cares about democracy, or cares about the people of Taiwan, or cares about self-determination. The United States' key strategy there is to, if there is a war, ensure that the semiconductor industry of Taiwan, which is critical, doesn't fall into China's hands, or if it looks like it's going to fall into Chinese hands, will be destroyed by the United States to ensure it can't fall into China's hands. It's not about democracy or the rights of the Taiwanese people. And why would we join a war like that, which would create a catastrophic outcome for Taiwan when we know that that's what's behind it from the United States? I think it would be extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, one way to answer this is fairly simple. I mean, I oppose the American invasion of Iran, but I don't advocate going to war against America. To express that opposition, I do think that we have to sympathise with the situation that Taiwan is in. It's an extremely difficult position for them to be in. They face a horrendous choice between, on the one hand, just slipping further into PRC's embrace, the potential loss of freedoms that may imply, or volunteering themselves as a pawn in an America-China conflict and potentially ending up as the Ukraine of Asia. Neither of those situations are particularly attractive, so I think we do need to be advocating for a retention of the status quo and the ability of the people of Taiwan to decide the future for themselves. But just to echo David's point, a war for Taiwan, so to speak, would not be a war for Taiwan. It would be nice to think that Australia and America went to war for freedom and democracy, but it's simply not the case. That war would be the decisive showdown between China and the US for economic and political dominance of East Asia, a war that both sides have been gearing up for. Taiwan might be the trigger for that, but that wouldn't be the purpose of that war. So Australia should certainly have no part of any conflict like that.